Getting your bow moving faster and getting nice articulate bounced spiccato strokes is something that we bass players need to use. I use it every single day, and this is a part 2 to a video I did recently on spiccato. I will have that and many other resources linked up in the description. But former podcast guest Aidan Plank reached out and asked if I could do a follow-up video on fast spiccato. So in today's video, we're going to get into the topic of fast spiccato, how you can learn it, and how you can apply it in different musical situations. We cover topics like this and much more in our weekly email newsletter. We also offer monthly free sheet music and much more. If you're not on the list, consider subscribing. So let's start with a primer on bow physics in general. And I've done a video several years ago, but I think it's still very helpful about just moving the bow on the double bass in general. I will link up to that up top and down below. I think it's helpful to realize how much springiness and bounciness there is both in the bow and in the strings, and we can use and harness and capture that inherent springiness. Before I dig into any of the specifics, I just want to start by getting a feel for the bounciness of the bow. So I'm way out at the tip. French and German are the same idea, but I'm going to do this video on French because this requires a little bit more skill on my part. So I'm just letting my bow land on the string, and I'm letting the bow itself and the strings carry through it and continue bouncing. And I'm playing around with different placements and speeds and angle of the hair. As I get closer to the middle, that bounciness is going away. There are a couple rebounds, and by the time I get to the balance point, which is about here on my bow, there's basically no bounce back. The bow just lands on the string. In the first part on this series, which is kind of like slow to medium spiccato, we're really controlling every bounce of the bow. So in that video, which you can go and watch, and there's a worksheet associated with that, there is a distinct control of every bounce. I am letting the bow bounce, but I'm really moving the bow back and forth with my arm. So we're going to go at this fast spiccato stroke kind of two different directions. I'm going to start with that initial controlled bounce, that slow and medium spiccato bounce that we'd explored in the first video in this series. For this next step, we're just going to take that bounce and reduce everything. So if we start at a speed of like 80 beats per minute, 85 beats per minute on the metronome, everything is still nice and in control. Notice I'm closing a note rather than playing open strings. And it's because the open strings have a little bit of a different quality when you're bouncing on them. You, of course, will bounce on your open strings, but I think it's helpful to get a feel for a closed note for these strokes and then kind of apply it to open strings. I'm also playing right now on the A string. A string and D string, I think, are a good place to start, and then you can map it out over to the outer strings once you get the stroke under control. I like going up one click on the metronome if you have an old school metronome, or like 5 numbers, so like from 80 to 85 to 90 for this kind of practice. And I find that it's really helpful to do a little bit of this spiccato development every day. For me, it's really not my best bow stroke. Maybe some people it is, but for me, it's something that requires some active maintenance. So I just make sure I'm being consistent with it and patient with it and making sure that I'm staying as relaxed as possible. And that is key for, well, for anything on the bass, but I think especially for this kind of stroke, you cannot have rigor mortis tension in your body. That will not work. You cannot be completely loosey-goosey. That will not work either. So just finding that in-between spot where you are holding the bow with a bit of, I don't know if firmness is the right word, but not super loose, but also not super tight. Great analogy that I've heard for decades and have used myself is to just think about how it feels to bounce a basketball. You're not going to bounce a basketball like this. You're also not going to bounce a basketball like this. It's somewhere in between. I like to start with the metronome on 80. Think that I'm playing 16th notes and use a stroke that I remember Brad Opland in the Chicago Symphony calling onf. So that's O-N-F-F. And I love that word because I am not trying to play this stroke off the string. I'm not going to go something like that. I'm going to start on the string and I'm going to let the natural bounciness of the bow hair, the bow stick, and the bounciness of the string, the relaxation in my arm, and the spot in the bow all work together to get the bow stick to jump a bit, not the hair. And you know, 80 is kind of one of those gray zones where you could let the hair come off a little bit, but I think for developing this faster stroke, try to keep the hair on the string and find a spot. It's going to be near your balance point where the bow stick will have a little bit of springiness to it. You'll find that tilting the bow hair more or less will have an impact. You'll find that being closer to the bridge or further away from the bridge will have an impact. You'll find that the dynamic has an impact, and all that kind of stuff is important. But my recommendation is to focus on the sound. You want to get this sort of peppery, zingy sound. You don't want to do what people call press and rub, so you don't want to just... I don't think that's that interesting a sound, and most people probably don't. You want to get that sound with a little bit of distinction, but really feel like you're keeping the hair on the string. So the second approach, and this might seem weird, but I find this incredibly helpful, is to work on developing what's called a Sautillé stroke. That is a fast, it ends up looking like a spiccato. It's in the spiccato family, let's say. It's in the off the string family, but it is achieved really by keeping the bow on the string and relaxing in the right spots and letting the bow do what the bow does best. And what you'll find is a lot of orchestra pieces, and especially excerpts we're required to play, kind of sit in the cracks where it's a little too fast for the controlled spiccato, and then it's a little too slow for the Sautillé. But working on both and trying to kind of meet in the middle so you can approach in both of these ways is very helpful. And the way I've always taught this, if you have a better way, leave it in the comments. Many ways to teach this. I am certainly not the authority. I just am someone who's done this a little bit over his life. So I'm going to start out at the tip and just do a tremolo. And really, not even trying to get like a forte sound, just trying to like have a nice loose feel, whether it's French or German, just trying to really be nice and loose in the joint and the wrists and fingers. And if I look at my right fingers and hand, there will be a little bit of relaxation, a little bit of motion. It's not completely floppy, but it's also not rigid at all. And then just taking this and moving it in slowly toward the middle of the bow. All of a sudden, there's going to be this spot where the bow starts to spring on its own. And I'm really trying to keep my bow on the string and just let that jump happen with the stick. And again, I'm listening for the sound. I don't really care how far off or not off it comes if it's not the sound I like. So trying to find a sound that I like and spend a little bit of every day doing this excellent versus like hammering away and getting frustrated. That will reap much more rewards, and I find that true for vibrato or any other skill that might take a little bit to kind of settle. Just making it a practice, working it into your practice, that's very helpful in my opinion. So you kind of go the opposite way with this Sautillé approach. You start at whatever tempo that was comfortable. For me, that was 160, and then every day you just kind of notch it down. So if I go to 155, I find this stroke really benefits from using flat hair. The other approach, the more controlled approach, is oftentimes helped out if you use just a little bit of a tilt in the hair. So that's how fast spiccato can be developed. And again, this is not something that necessarily you get it and you got it forever. It's not a stroke that you just develop and then just paint on all the music. Every articulation on every note and in every dynamic from every different composer is going to be a little bit different. So once you develop just on one note and then start to move through a scale and then maybe doing two notes, that's going to feel a little bit different than just doing it repeated on one note. When you actually start to apply it to a piece of music, like I did with the slow/medium spiccato with Eine kleine Nachtmusik, or you use this for Mozart 40 or anything like that, just taking your time and understanding that every note is going to kind of have a little bit of a different approach. One of my favorite methods for working on this stroke, and I heard this in master classes ranging from the great Larry Hurst to Scott Pingle here at our Golden Gate Base Camp, is to start by repeating the bounce in tempo 8 times per note. So if we were doing Mozart 40, we could go like, and then we could do 4 times per note, 2 times per note, 1 time per note, do little chunks, do little bursts, just making sure that you develop the stroke you want to do at. I hope you found this video helpful. If you want to dig more into this topic, check it up. We've got linked up. We'll see you there.
Oh my God. Okay, so I can
Stop. Stop. Stop.
and then I think this is stop.